My name is Brad, and this is episode 4 in a YouTube lecture series about intonation in English called Listening for Meaning. In the previous episode, I further explored the two types of meanings that I introduced in episode 2, interpersonal and textual meanings, in terms of an important theoretical concept, metafunction, and showed how the different metafunctions of language are expressed in different ways. Interpersonal meanings are expressed prosodically, spreading out across the units where they apply, while textual meanings are expressed periodically, as often regularized waves of varying levels of prominence assigned to the different meanings in a text. In this episode, I introduce another important aspect of systemic functional theory, stratification, via an exploration of the modern historical development of intonation studies. Stratification theorizes the way language works as a complex sign system to relate the physical and the abstract, or as Halliday put it, the two realms of matter and meaning, the material and the semiotic. Halliday's stratification model responds to the imperative stated by his teacher, J.R. Firth, that the linguist must be clearly aware of the levels at which he is making his abstractions and statements, or what David Butt refers to as knowing one's semiotic address. Where in the theory is what I am saying located? For example, in the previous episode, which metafunction am I talking about here? The SFL stratification model also builds on work by Louis Hjelmslev and Sidney Lamb in creating further differentiation within the content and expression planes of language in the traditional model. So in SFL, language is made up of systems and structures at different levels of abstraction, termed strata: phonetics, phonology, lexicogrammar, and semantics. Halliday added a further stratum to this stratification model, context, also in response to theoretical work by Firth, who in turn was building on work by the ethnographer Bronislaw Malinowski, to account for how the contextual aspects of any situation and the culture behind them are manifested in the language used, and so must be taken into account in analysing language, as they are when we are engaging in discourse. Unlike in the classical conception of a sign as a binary of signifier and signified, it is the stratification of language that enables us to account for how we can mean more than one thing at once, and thereby massively expand our meaning potential. As Halliday puts it in the Introduction to Functional Grammar, the stratification of the content plane had immense significance in the evolution of the human species. It is not an exaggeration to say that it turned Homo into Homo sapiens. I will come back to discuss stratification in this respect in a later episode in relation to a child's development of language. So, as mentioned in this episode, I focus on the phonology of intonation and the relation between phonology and phonetics. Phonetics and phonology are the two strata within the SFL stratification model that form the expression plane of language. Phonetics describes the physical sounds of language and how they are articulated in the vocal tract, so the material realm, while phonology describes the abstract organisation of sound into systems and structures to express meanings, which thus are part of the semiotic realm. I will come back to the two strata of the content plane, lexicogrammar and semantics, in later episodes, as well as context, although they are all implicated in the phonological analysis of intonation, as I show in this episode. The quote here from Miriam Taverniers relates the two strata of the expression plane, phonology and phonetics, in SFL, back to the Hjelmslev model from which they partly originate. Within the expression plane, the distinction between form and substance conforms to the contrast between phonology and phonetics. Okay, to get into a discussion of the phonology of intonation, let's go back to one particular tone choice and the metafunctional perspective on it from the previous episode. I briefly discussed as an example and illustration the prosodic expression of interpersonal meaning by reference to the sharp rise-fall-rise tone 2 plus contour, as shown in this Praat image. It rained today. As I mentioned, this tone choice is familiar from the incredulous expression, "Who, me?" to someone who has unexpectedly identified us in some way. The way I spoke the title of this episode was also using this tone, listening for meaning, which may have sounded quite odd for a title, as this tone sounds very interactive. The rise-fall-rise contour in the example in this slide is stretched across the whole tone group unit. While the tone contour begins on the tonic syllable with the initial rise on reigned, the full expression of this tone choice continues through to the end of the tone group unit. And as I mentioned in the SFL approach, this rise-fall-rise contour is to be taken as a whole, as one tone choice spread prosodically across the whole unit, not as two distinct choices or contours. In this episode, I compare this prosodic approach to intonation to the segmental approach that has dominated intonation studies since the 1970s. So here is another example of this tone from Robert Ladd's 1996 book, Intonational Phonology. I have transcribed my interpretation of the intonation of this example here. In particular, I want to focus on the two responses to the initiating move. I hear Sue's taking a course to be a driving instructor. Sue? Driving instructor? So even though this text is from the printed page, I know confidently which tones are in the reply in this dialogue, not just from the pitch contours represented in these images or the punctuation, both of which are shown in the Ladd book as presented in this slide, but because of the meanings being enacted. The tone 2+ choice is typical for this sort of reply, being the same sort of incredulous reply as, "Who, me?" that I mentioned before, or "It rained today" in the previous slide. I will come back to my textual intonation choices in the interpretation of this written text in the next episode. Here is a Praat image of the reply I have just spoken, showing the two pitch contours as blue lines in their alignment with the words. Sue? A driving instructor? Note here, as I mentioned earlier in episode 2, my transcription symbol for this tone is different to Halliday's. Halliday represented this secondary tone 2 contour with an underscore underneath the 2 numeral. However, this is impossible to do in Praat, and anyway, this form of representation is inconsistent with other secondary tone choices, such as the high-falling tone 1 contour, which has a plus symbol after the numeral 1. So I previously used to put the underscore symbol after the 2 numeral, as you can see in this image from an earlier presentation. However, since then, I have changed the underscore to a plus sign. Halliday used the underscore to represent the low-falling tone 1 contour, and a plus sign to represent the high-falling tone 1 contour. So I consider the sharp rise-fall-rise contour to be more like the high-falling tone 1 contour, i.e. exaggerated, rather than the narrow, low-falling tone 1 contour. I will come back to discuss secondary tone choices in a later episode. I mentioned last episode that I want to introduce Praat in this series, both in terms of its use and its limitations. I will go into more detail on its use in the next episodes. It is particularly good for marking out the boundaries of units of intonation, such as the foot and the tone group in this slide here, and in helping to identify textual choices in particular, by using the waveform shown at the top of this Praat image and the spectrogram below it, to identify precisely where such boundaries and choices are located along the timeline. And Praat can produce a very good representation of pitch contours, particularly when the speech is invented rather than naturally occurring, such as in this slide, which shows the two rise-fall-rise contours that I have just spoken quite clearly. Here is a Praat picture that has been generated from my spoken version, showing the contours in their alignment with the lexis, which makes an excellent illustration of this contour type that would be useful for pedagogic or publication purposes. However, Praat is often unreliable for identifying tone choices, in particular in everyday naturally occurring speech. For example, where there are people speaking over one another in dialogue or where there is background sound. This Praat image represents a short excerpt from the beginning of a casual conversation which I used as data for my PhD, thanks to my supervisor Christian Matheson, who provided the data to me. This excerpt was in reply to an initiating move in a conversation designed to shift the topic to discussion of a hailstorm event which had occurred recently. "What happened to all? You had a bit of hailstorm damage, didn't you?" "A bit? A bit?" As you can perhaps hear by now, the repeated tone choice on "a bit" is again the same sharp rise, fall, rise tone 2+ we have heard in this and the previous lectures. For example, on "Sue," "a bit." But you can see from the pitch representation by Praat in this slide that Praat can be entirely inaccurate or worse, misleading in such cases. Although this conversation was recorded in a studio, the overlapping of different voices at this point in the conversation, which is a point where the conversation shifts topic, renders the blue line representation unusable. So I recommend to use Praat primarily as an annotation platform and to help in distinguishing textual choices and unit boundaries. But in terms of identifying tone choices, I suggest you just use your ears and your theoretical knowledge, as I show in this series. This tone 2+ contour, although it is classified as a secondary tone variation, is actually very common in everyday life. The systemic distinction in Halliday's description between primary and secondary tones does not imply their relative importance or frequency of occurrence. And although we may not be conscious of its use, this tone choice is very familiar to us. We can find many instances in the wild, in naturally occurring everyday speech. But for illustrative purposes, let's consider an example from captivity, from a film production. In the first minute of this short excerpt from the Monty Python film Life of Brian, pictured in this slide, for example, there are 3 instances of this tone 2+. I've put a link to this video excerpt from the movie in the description. See if you can spot these 3 tone 2+ contours by listening to the video. Okay, so how did you go? So firstly, at 28 seconds, in response to Brian's, "Don't pass judgment on other people or else you might get judged too," the Terry Jones character replies, "Who, me?" querying the idea that he too might get judged. He can't quite believe his luck. And his incredulity is expressed through this sharp rise, fall, rise tone to a contour. The second instance, at 38 seconds, is where the man asks for the gourd and Brian tells him he can have it, to which the man responds, "Have it?" He can't quite believe that he can just have it like that without having to haggle for it. And the third instance, at 46 seconds, is the woman's incredulous reply, "Consider the lilies." So, as you can see, this sharp rise, fall, rise tone contour is quite common and thus familiar, even if we are not conscious of its use in everyday conversation. Now, let's return to the world of academia and Ladd's example text I've shown earlier and examine his phonological account of this tone. So, according to Ladd, from the perspective of what he terms the auto-segmental metrical approach, in his example text, we are not dealing with a global rise, fall, rise shape that applies holistically to an entire utterance. The rise, fall, rise shape that spanned the entire one-syllable utterance in Sue is not simply stretched out over the 6-syllable utterance here. Instead, the contour is seen to consist of a sequence of at least 2 discrete events, an accentual feature consisting of a rise through a prominent syllable, here drive, followed by a fall, and an edge tone consisting of a rise during the last few tenths of a second of the utterance. For the identity of the tune, it is the accentual rise-fall and the boundary rise that count. They are the distinguishing features that lead us to describe the contour on Sue and that on a driving instructor as the same. And the italics here are from the original. Ladd continues, By breaking down the contour into component parts in this way, we do not, of course, preclude the possibility of larger units. We have not questioned the existence of a rise-fall-rise nuclear tone in English. We have simply been more explicit about its internal structure. The rise-fall-rise unit can be seen as a composite or superordinate unit. There is no necessary contradiction in recognising both the functional unity of nuclear tones or other such tunes and the phonological separateness of their component parts. There does seem to be a characteristic rise-fall-rise intonational unit in English, but it can probably be distinguished from essentially adventitious sequences of a falling accent and an independently selected boundary rise. And here I've added the italics and bold. So for Ladd, from a segmental perspective on phonology, the rise at the end in the second utterance is an independently selected, distinct phonological event. According to Ladd, this is not just the same contour repeated with different lexes for each. For Ladd, the separate segments he distinguishes are part of the phonological description, and the purpose of phonology here is clearly to describe the structural, compositional characteristics of the pitch movements in segmental terms. The unitary contour is considered a superordinate unit composed of those segments, but not part of the phonological description, but functional description. This raises the issue of what phonology is, or what is the purpose or function of a phonological description, and by implication, what is the theoretical approach behind that phonological description. As the Pike quote from the previous episode, which I include again here for easy reference, articulates, different theories as tools determine not only how you understand things, but even what you actually see or see as important. As Klaus Kohler puts it more succinctly, theoretical and methodological paradigms in speech research determine the design of data collection, their analysis, and their interpretation. So, Ladd's account above represents one way of looking at these speech phenomena, deriving from a particular theoretical perspective, auto-segmental metrical phonology, based on a segmental approach to describing phonology. I argue in this episode that this dominant segmental approach to intonational phonology is at least partly explained by the development of the modern history of linguistics as a science, and its impact on the development of intonation studies. The origins of this segmental approach in fact go back to Leonard Bloomfield in the US, who, according to David Crystal, was the first to apply the prior determined techniques of segmental phonemic analysis to intonation, notating distinctive segments only. For words, these segments are morphemes, which Bloomfield in 1926 called a minimum form. Then, as Goldsmith in his 1976 PhD titled Auto-Segmental Phonology states, if we look at the American linguistic tradition in the decade of the 1940s, with contributions by, among others, Bloch, Harris, Haugen, Smith, Traeger, and Wells, all begin with the initial assumption that logically the first procedure in linguistic analysis is to slice the linguistic signal vertically into a number of pieces, segments we may call them. Thus, Ladd's auto-segmental metrical approach, which is based on Janet Pierre Humbert's 1980 PhD, a page of which is shown in this image, draws on an American segmental tradition going back to Bloomfield. Ladd, in a 2000 paper, writes, this segmental approach remains to this day, quote, unquestionably the currently dominant approach to intonational description. This dominance is now being institutionalized in the form of ToBI-style transcription systems, end quote. ToBI is an acronym for tone and break indices, the phonological transcription system most widely used globally, which is based on this segmental approach. But how did this segmental approach come to dominate intonation studies, to the extent that the approach found in the work by leading scholars from Sweet through to Halliday from the 1970s onwards has been relegated to the sidelines? I will offer one argument now. As Kohler observes, The scientific approaches to spoken language have been shaped by the dominating influence of the dichotomy of phonology, dealing with discrete mental objects, and phonetics, dealing with infinitely fine gradation of physical manifestation. They have been associated with the humanities and the sciences, respectively, since the first half of the 20th century. This distinction evokes C.P. Snow's two cultures argument that I mentioned in episode 1, pointing to the broader academic disciplinarity that divides the study of the physical expression plane and abstract meaning. To extend Kohler's point from my own experience and observation, the academic domain of phonetics phonology is kept distinct from that of grammar discourse. This was illustrated at my alma mater, Macquarie Uni, during my PhD candidature, where the grammar and discourse people were on the 4th floor and the phonetics and phonology people were on the 5th floor. And I got plenty of exercise running up and down the stairs between the two. But there is very little correspondence between these two fields or sets of fields and their respective academic disciplines. I think the key to this divide lies at the beginning of the Kohler quote, the scientific approaches. The study of intonation in the 20th century developed in relation to, firstly, the push towards a scientific study of phonology within the context of the early to mid-20th century development of linguistics as a science, which involved a particular conception of what science is and what it can do. Bloomfield, for example, in his influential 1933 book Language, advocated for a scientific materialism or a bottom-up approach to the scientific study of language, which for intonation means a science thus based on the study of the physical material sound or the form as a first step prior to consideration of abstract meaning or function. Meanwhile, the development of intonation studies was in the context of the availability of increasingly powerful instruments for recording and studying sound, with scholars increasingly focusing on the physical expression plane via instrumental methods as the most reliable path to developing a scientific understanding of intonation. This focus on scientific materialism via instrumental methods went along with experimental laboratory methods and data, also considered scientific. So data tended to be invented speech examples such as the lad example above, what I call domesticated text, rather than studying authentic, naturally occurring speech in the wild. So all of this can be characterised as what Kowalski, the character in the Nickelodeon cartoon series Penguins of Madagascar, would refer to as science, skipper. Thus, the aim to achieve a scientific basis for descriptions of intonation, as well as the increased power to instrumentally analyse and describe intonational phenomena as physical sound, led to a focus on form, i.e. the material base, before function, abstract meaning. That is, to a bottom-up materialist approach with the underlying assumption that form and function could be studied separately and in sequence. This is illustrated in these two quotations. Firstly, Crystal in 1969 wrote, "All that emphasising a formal as opposed to a semantic or notional approach to description implies is that procedurally, considerations of meaning do not enter in until a stable basis of formally defined features has been determined. Then a more satisfactory classification of meanings can be carried out." And this is also reflected in this quote from Maria Schubager in 1965, who wrote, "The investigation of English intonation has reached a point where its form has been explored almost to perfection, but the various attempts to assess its function have resulted in a mosaic of partly concordant, partly divergent opinions." So both these quotes assume that it is possible to study form as a separate and prior step to studying function. The resulting mosaic of detailed but inconsistent descriptions of the semantic functions of these formally determined phonological features, which is perhaps better described as a mess, is, I argue, the inevitable result of such a bottom-up approach wherein the study of form is divorced from considerations of function. Alongside or as part of this formal approach, instrumental methods of studying speech were considered more reliable and objective, more scientific, while impressionistic descriptions deriving from the pedagogic tradition of intonation study for language teaching purposes, which was dominant in the 19th and early 20th century, came to be considered unscientific. So David Crystal refers to the misleading impressionistic statements and unscientific impressionism deriving from the demands of English language teaching in the early decades of this century. And Ladd writes, because of the general lack of agreement and the notable absence of instrumental evidence for impressionistic descriptions, adherents of the instrumental approach have often felt that their work is somehow more rigorous and more scientific. Thus, the push for developing a science of linguistics resulted in an instrumental, bottom-up or formal approach to intonation, in tandem with the dominance of a segmental view on language and speech phenomena in general. So to come back to the Ladd example, for Ladd, from the bottom-up segmental perspective, the second utterance shown in this image does indeed have two distinct phonological events rather than being the same single tone choice as in the first utterance, Sue. In a driving instructor, looked at from below, there is an initial rise-fall event or segment, followed later on by a final rise segment. This approach reveals that for Ladd, phonology is about describing the formal phonetic components of the sound signal as a first step in terms of their distinctive patterning, not in functional terms in terms of what they do, but from the bottom up as distinguishing phonetic patterns. And this bottom-up view, I think, goes along with the segmental viewpoint. We see the pitch contour as a composite structure of several discrete pitch events, rather than functionally as the unitary prosodic expression of an interpersonal choice. This segmental approach thus views phonology in compositional terms as a structure composed of segments, also referred to as a sequence of pitch levels, for example in the ToBI system. As I showed in the previous episode, a compositional or constituent form is associated with the experiential metafunction. Thus, as Halliday and Greaves wrote, treating tone as a sequence of pitch heights makes it analogous to the constituent-like structure that is typical of experiential meanings. This is related to what Per Linnell has termed the written language bias in linguistics, also addressed in Halliday's 1985 book Spoken and Written Language. Written language, representing phonemic language, primarily records and privileges experiential meaning over interpersonal and textual meanings, particularly, of course, those latter meanings expressed through intonation. As I showed earlier, according to Crystal, this segmental approach to intonation derives from the prior study of phonemes. Bloomfield, quote, was the first to apply the prior determined techniques of segmental phonemic analysis to intonation, end quote. We can thus argue that there is an experiential bias in linguistics and in intonation studies. This experiential written language bias, I argue, prevails to this day across most, if not all, areas of linguistics and discourse studies, even where the object of study is ostensibly spoken language and phonology. But this bottom-up form before function approach is certainly not the only way in town of doing phonology. For Prince Nikolai Sergeyevich Trubetskoy, the scholar who, according to Oxford bibliographies, is regarded by many as the creator of the science of phonology, it is the task of phonology to study which differences in sound are related to differences in meaning in a given language, and a phonological description needs to consider only that aspect of sound which fulfills a specific function in the language. The italics are in the original. In this approach, the phonologist starts with the perspective of meaning distinction, of language function, asking how that meaning distinction is expressed in what sound distinction. Form and function are thus intimately related, both as essential aspects of the overall description of meaning and its expression in sound, and of their analysis, So, to repurpose the crystal quote earlier, before a stable basis of formal features can be determined, we have to consider as a first step both distinctions in form, or patterns in sound, and their discourse functions together. We must consider what is meaningful in the culture as expressed in sound patterns. One can actually find the same idea in the 1926 Bloomfield publication that I quoted from earlier. For Bloomfield in 1926, a morpheme is a recurrent meaningful form which cannot in turn be analysed into smaller recurrent meaningful forms. So as you can see, there's an assumption in brackets that meaning is an integral part of the process of analysing language. But over the subsequent years for Bloomfield, meaning came to be excluded as a methodological and theoretical consideration. The full quote from which I drew the expression scientific materialism above is, "It may be stated as a principle that in all sciences like linguistics, which observe some specific type of human activity, the worker must proceed exactly as if he held the materialistic view. This practical effectiveness is one of the strongest considerations in favour of scientific materialism." End quote. This shift in perspective went on to have influential consequences for American linguistics and, by extension, intonation study globally. But there is a longer tradition in linguistics and intonation study. This picture is the title page from Henry Sweet's 1877 Handbook of Phonetics, considered a pioneering work in modern phonetics and phonology studies. Henry Sweet, of course, is considered one of the bases for the character Professor Henry Higgins in Pygmalion, although Daniel Jones, a friend of George Bernard Shaw's but an intensely private person, is also considered to have been a basis. As mentioned in episode 2, this early work on intonation included many of the core components of the model that would continue in the European tradition through to Halliday's account. Sweet's approach to phonology was synthetic or holistic in nature. For Sweet, considerations of phonetic phenomena and of their functions in making meaning were never far away from each other, as one can see in the image in this slide which I presented in episode 2, where we can read and see familiar descriptions and depictions of pitch contours as tones, as well as quite an accurate if brief sketch of their discourse functions, all together on the same page. J.R. Firth, Halliday's teacher, wrote of Sweet, whom he admired, that he bequeathed to the phoneticians coming after him the problems of synthesis which still continue to vex us. However, this early synthesis of phonetics and function had almost entirely disappeared a century later in mainstream phonological studies of intonation, as a result of the developments in phonology and linguistics more generally outlined above. The bottom-up segmental approach to a science of linguistics and intonation studies. Nevertheless, I argue that Halliday's systemic functional account of intonation, building upon Firth's theoretical groundwork, addresses the problems of synthesis mentioned by Firth and thus offers a useful alternative view on intonation, as both material and semiotic, meaning and expression treated theoretically and procedurally as two sides of the one coin. As Professor Braj Kachru, Firth's last student, once outlined to me in conversation, my own work sits within this holistic tradition from Sweet to Firth to Halliday via my teacher Bill Greaves. This approach is the origin of the title of this series, Listening for Meaning. To listen not so much to physical sound alone, but to distinctions in sound and meaning, form and function, in an approach that synthesizes the two via the theoretical model of stratification. So in the SFL approach to phonology, as Halliday and Greaves wrote, when we talk about the sound system of English, the significance of any category we refer to, such whether a prosodic category such as pitch movement or an articulatory one such as the shape and position of the tongue, will be its semigenic value, its function in the total meaning potential of the English language. This is a phonological consideration. So approaching this example from this holistic meaning-based perspective enables us to account for the rising pitch at the end of the tone group in both functional and formal terms, without either being prior or privileged in either theory or analytical practice. The final rise, seen by Ladd as an independent pitch event, from the SFL perspective specifies the tone choice as not being a rising contour tone 2, but as part of the expression of the rise-fall-rise tone 2 plus contour, an interpersonal choice expressed prosodically across the entire unit in which it appears. The metafunctional profile also enables us to distinguish the tone contours as interpersonal from the varying pitch levels as textual, resolving the long-running debate in the literature going back to the early 1950s about whether intonational phenomena consist of a series of contours or of pitch levels. The metafunctional analysis of phonological choices is thus also part of the process of the phonological analysis, as well as stratification, that is, to arrive at this phonological explanation in considering the phonetic sounds, as I have shown. We must consider not just phonetics, but the higher strata in a functional meaning-based perspective on phonetics and phonology. In terms of SFL theory, the concept of function underlies the stratificational model. Choices made at one stratum function as the realization of choices at the stratum above, and are realized in the stratum below. Example, phonological choices, which are realized by phonetic choices, function to realize choices in lexicogrammar, which in turn realize choices in semantics. And the concept of metafunction helps in understanding the different discourse functions of phonological choices, which express interpersonal and textual meanings. There are other theoretical concepts and aspects that are also relevant, which I will introduce as the series goes on. For example, the fundamental concept of system in SFL helps in understanding that the rise-fall-rise contour is not the same systemic choice as the simple rising contour. This systemic principle is also important in analysing the sound stream in terms of the phonological choices being made. So in this series, I take an approach, that of SFL, based on the idea put forward in this quote by about Firth by Palmer, that above all he, Firth, rejected the current view that the linguist must start at the bottom and work up. The simile that Firth liked to use in his later years was of the lift that moved freely from one level to another without giving priority to one and without proceeding in any one direction. More broadly, to use the David Butt phrase that I mentioned earlier, I aim to know and specify in this series what the semiotic address is of whatever phenomena I am talking about, which metafunction, is it interpersonal, textual, logical, experiential, which stratum, phonetics, phonology, lexicogrammar, semantics, or context, and in the next episodes, which rank, the syllable, foot, or tone group, which axis I'm talking about, system or structure, and whereabouts along the line of instantiation. Am I talking about instances, patterns, or sub-potentials, or the entire semiotic potential of a particular language system? These are three more theoretical concepts that are essential in understanding intonation within a systemic functional perspective. These altogether form the major aspects or dimensions of SFL theory and guide any analysis or discussion that I present about intonation in this series. Hence, I've tried to address them relatively early on. Intonation is physical sound, but I can't talk about the physical realm of sound unless I'm clear about the theoretical viewpoint I'm taking in talking about such phenomena.